I'm kind of in the early stages of my PhD research, so this presentation is going to share my theoretical framework and the emerging hypotheses that I'm generating through my research. And at the heart of my research is this quote by Isoda about the challenges of implementing Japanese lesson study in international contexts, in non-Japanese nations, and how that might affect the way lesson study is implemented, but also the impact it is intended to have on teachers and on pupils. My previous work looked at identifying the critical components of lesson study as enacted in Japan. And this slide represents those 7 critical components. So this was from a literature review of literature written by Japanese users of lesson study, but also by people who have observed the lesson study process and can speak Japanese, because obviously every time an international observer watches lesson study, they're interpreting it through the lens of their own cultural understanding. And these features can help us to see what happens when it's translated into other contexts. Are these features adhered to, or are they changed? And in line with that, I've been looking at, as a backup to that, my previous work also looked at whether international lesson study models do adhere to these features. And what I found is that while some features were quite closely adhered to, so there was a lot of collaborative planning, for example, but very little what we call Kyozai Kenku, which is a study of research materials, part of the planning process. There was a lot of live observation of lessons, which is what you would want to see in Japanese lesson study, but very little identification of a research theme, very little use of a koshi or external expert, and very little attention paid to mobilizing knowledge from one lesson study group to the next. So some features being quite well adhered to in terms of Japanese lesson study, and other features definitely deviating from those processes as they would appear in Japan. So in order to understand this, I've been looking at 2 bodies of literature. And the first body of literature is around implementation science. And there are 2 ways to approach implementation. It's interesting that this was raised by Becky Francis this morning as being really crucial to understanding how interventions are successful or unsuccessful. So we can look at the fidelity paradigm, which is largely, as written here, from medical and prevention science. And in the fidelity paradigm, high fidelity is key, but exactly what high fidelity looks like is not always clear. We know that fidelity can fluctuate over time. We know that fidelity, the fidelity paradigm is really important for very simple innovations which don't take account of context, but for more complex interventions, the fidelity paradigm can be a little more problematic. Then we have the adaptation paradigm. Historically, this has been seen as implementation failure, but increasingly there's now a sense from the literature that for complex interventions, adaptation is the way to go. Having said that, the pathway to adaptation is fraught with complexities that are not fully resolved by the literature. There is mention of identifying the critical components of an intervention if you want to make adaptations, and it's not always clear how you might do that. And it's very unclear at which point adaptation may go too far, and the intervention you introduce may be a completely different intervention to the one that was intended. So what this relates to in terms of lesson study is this quote here, again by another Japanese author. The Japanese themselves expect that when lesson study is implemented in contexts other than Japan, there will be modifications, and that's definitely in line with the adaptation paradigm. But how do we know which adaptations are reasonable to make and which adaptations might completely prevent the intervention being implemented as intended and cause problems in terms of impact for teachers and pupils, but also in terms of longevity of the use of lesson study as a system for teacher professional development. So the second body of literature that helps us understand this is the work of Hofstede on culture. This is Hofstede's definition of culture. And we can use Hofstede's research into culture to understand what happens when an intervention like lesson study is translated from one cultural context to another. What Hofstede has done is provided a set of national cultural profiles along 6 different dimensions. So the first dimension is power distance, which is the extent to which there is an acceptance that there is an unequal distribution of power, that certain people are in charge and certain people are subordinates. The next dimension is individualism, or on the flip side, collectivism. To what do we attribute more value? To everyone looking after themselves and their own immediate family, or to adhering to strong collective groups, cohesive groups to which you belong, which take care of you and to which you have some kind of loyalty. The third dimension is long-term orientation. So this is really your ability to defer immediate gratification, to be focused on future rewards that might involve perseverance and resilience to achieve. Next, we have masculinity versus femininity, quite an obvious one, in which in masculine societies, we have very definite gender roles. In feminine societies, we have quite gender neutral roles, and everybody is supposed to be tender and gentle and concerned with others in this sort of stereotypical feminine sense. Then fifth dimension is uncertainty avoidance. And this is the degree to which people will be threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations and try to avoid those situations arising. And then the final dimension is indulgence versus restraint. So this is the degree to which culture believes that it's okay to indulge your human desires, to have fun, to enjoy yourself, and the degree to which that is seen as something to be curbed or restrained or restricted. And if we look at the profile of Japan, we have a very interesting profile in terms of those national dimensions. You will see for 3 of those national dimensions, Japan is ranked in the highest quartile according to the rankings. So that is masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation. And what that enables us to do is to think about how those 3 extreme scores may have affected the shape of lesson study and its enactment amongst Japanese teachers and within Japanese schools. So this diagram here tries to map those 3 dimensions and look at how they may have affected the design, the shape, and the implementation of lesson study in Japan. So if we look at masculinity, we know that in masculine countries, people will seek opportunities for a public display of their practice, and lesson study definitely offers that. You can volunteer to be the teacher that teaches the lesson in front of your colleagues so that your work can be critiqued. If you're a strong practitioner, that's something that you would seek to do in Japan. It's very important there are opportunities for career progression, and lesson study provides a framework for Japanese teachers in which to seek career progression through teaching the research lessons, through critiquing their colleagues and being seen to offer productive criticism, through taking on responsibility for research groups or getting involved in local, regional, or national lesson study projects. And finally, in masculine cultures, there is a definite tendency to commit time to your job beyond your standard working hours. And we know that this is definitely the case in Japan. Quite considerable amounts of time are committed to the planning process for Japanese lesson study. If we then look at the overlap with the feature of uncertainty avoidance, so again, what we find here is also in uncertainty avoidant cultures, there is a tendency to commit time to working beyond your normal working hours. What we also know is that in uncertainty avoidant cultures, there is a tendency to cling to rules, procedures, rituals, and lesson study is certainly a very ritualistic and rule-bound process. We know that expertise is revered in uncertainty avoidant cultures, and the role of the koshi, or the external expert, which Su-Lin talked about, is really crucial to a successful lesson study process. And finally, we know that Japanese teachers can commit quite considerable time to what is a very lengthy and meticulous research and lesson planning process before they actually teach the lesson. And that's definitely that lengthy and meticulous kind of preparation process is definitely a feature of uncertainty avoidance societies. Finally, if we look at the overlaps then with long-term orientation, the third extreme feature, again, we have those two features emerging. So there would be a tendency to work beyond your hours in a long-term oriented culture, and also to put a lot of time into planning and working towards a goal that you are trying to achieve. So the lesson planning for the research lesson. Then we do know that in Japan, a school research theme will last for 2, if not 3 years. So that's definitely a feature of long-term orientation. And we know that in long-term oriented cultures, there is a belief that all participants are learners. We are all in this together. We all work together productively to achieve our goals. And that's definitely the case in Japanese lesson study. And finally, in long-term oriented cultures, there is an expectation of humility, that you will receive criticism with humility. And that's definitely the case in the post-lesson discussions after research lessons, where teachers are expected to hear the critique of their colleagues, take those on board and learn from them. So if we look at this diagram, we can see how those features may have shaped the way lesson study has grown and developed within Japan. So let's take a little contrasting scenario here, which is the Netherlands. You will see here two features, 2 dimensions in which the Netherlands is very, very different to Japan. And so it's quite interesting to think then, when we implement lesson study in Japan, what might be the kinds of aspects or features of lesson study that teachers may struggle with. So if, given that the Netherlands is quite on the opposite side in terms of masculinity, we would expect that teachers may not be committed to dedicating sufficient time to lesson study, certainly, and not unless that's built into their working hours. They probably may not seek to be teaching research lessons, because that would be a public display of practice, which would not be part of their cultural expectations. And there is, in any case, less of a focus on career progression, and therefore less of a motivation to put yourself forward for those publicly facing opportunities in lesson study. In terms of uncertainty avoidance, we might guess that the Dutch teachers would be much less likely to adhere to the sort of protocols, rituals and processes for lesson study. The role of Koshi is likely to be undervalued. There would be, in a low uncertainty avoidant culture, there would be more of a sense that everybody brings practice expertise to the table, and why would we need external expertise? And finally, there would be less value seen in that lengthy lesson planning process. And that certainly could be quite damaging to the impact of lesson study. Increasingly in the UK lesson study groups I work with, we've come to believe that perhaps 50%, if not more, of the learning that teachers experience in lesson study is in the run-up to the research lesson, rather than the research lesson and the discussion itself. So that's just an example, but obviously if we put the 2 bodies of literature together, so implementation science and the role of culture, we can come up with some hypotheses about the challenges that different nations might face, depending on how they seek to implement lesson study, whether they seek to implement it with fidelity or they seek an adaptation paradigm, and whether their national cultural profile is very different to Japan or very similar. So this model you can see on your screen at the moment looks at countries who might have a very different cultural profile to Japan. They could either seek to adopt a fidelity paradigm or an adaptation paradigm. If they seek to adopt a fidelity paradigm, because their cultural profile is so very different, there may be some unintended adaptation, a kind of kickback, I guess, from teachers in terms of doing something that's completely culturally alien to them, which may lead to the impact being less than expected and difficulties with sustaining that over time. On the other hand, if a country like this takes an adaptation approach, then there's going to be some intended adaptation, which means that the impact may be possible, and also it may be sustained over time. Obviously, going back to my comments about adaptation, it's very difficult to know what successful adaptation looks like. So that brings its own complexity to the situation. Oops, sorry. If we then look at countries that have very similar profiles to Japan, again, they could take a fidelity or an adaptation paradigm. If they take a fidelity paradigm, they're likely to have high fidelity to those components, therefore likely to have the desired impact, and possibly that could be sustained over time. If they take an adaptation approach, then there will be obviously some intended adaptation. The desired impact is possible, and it's likely to be sustained over time. So it just raises some interesting questions that as practitioners, we might pose ourselves when we're looking to implement lesson study in a context that is not Japan. So first of all, to consider the national profile, how different it is to Japan and what the implications might be. Secondly, whether fidelity is important or whether you are comfortable with the idea of adaptation and that may contribute to impact and sustainability. And finally, what if you are going to take an adaptation approach, what are the adaptations that may be necessary given your country's cultural profile?